Hello, everyone. Bon après-midi à tous. My name is Sam Jordi. I'm the officer in charge of the Vulnerable Persons Unit at the RCMP National Headquarters in Ottawa. I would like to start by humbly acknowledging that the land from which I'm connecting with you today is the traditional, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin, Huron-Wendat, and the Anishinaabewaki nations. Les peuples algonquins vivant sur cette terre depuis de temps immémoriaux, et nous sommes reconnaissants d'avoir l'opportunité de vivre et de travailler sur ce territoire. I would like to also acknowledge all the territories and related treaties from where many of you join us today. On behalf of the RCMP, Contract and Indigenous Policing, and the Vulnerable Persons Unit, welcome to today's presentation. The presentation is scheduled for an hour and a half. Microphones and cameras have been disabled to ensure no disruptions. Please refrain from using any of the MS Teams functions besides the chat. Please also be advised that this presentation is being recorded. If you have any questions or comments, please submit them in the chat. If your name is not automatically or accurately displayed, please ensure that you indicate your name and your organization, followed by your comment or question. Please also feel free to submit your questions in French. It will be subsequently translated and shared with the guest speaker, who will answer in English, and we will then summarize her response in French. Feeling discomfort is a normal reaction when learning about horrific events that have shaped our world. Some discomfort can lead to greater understanding and growth. However, should you need to, you are encouraged to step away from the presentation at any time and reach out for support as needed, whether this is via the peer-to-peer network, employee assistance program, or otherwise. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Mrs. Nina Khan, who will introduce today's speaker. Mrs. Khan is currently the chair of the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship, which is established as a registered charity in Ottawa. Mrs. Khan was born in Israel and have lived in Ottawa for over 40 years. Both her parents were Holocaust survivors. An archaeologist by profession, she was a sessional professor at Carleton University and the Sample University, both in Ottawa. Ms. Khan, welcome. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to A Hidden Child, Never Silenced, a Holocaust Survivor's Story. Thank you, Sam, for your lovely introduction. I'm honored to represent the Center of Holocaust Education and Scholarship at this special gathering in recognition of April as Genocide Remembrance, Condemnation, and Prevention Month. I will start by sharing a few words about the Center of Holocaust Education and Scholarship and its work, and then I will talk a little bit about the program itself. CHESS was established in 2015 as a community volunteer organization to answer the growing needs of Holocaust education in Ottawa in response to the rise of anti-Semitism. CHESS' mission is to develop educational programs to promote understanding of the history and legacy of the Holocaust. We offer year-round programming whose objectives include combating anti-Semitism, prejudice, and racism, and promoting respect and diversity for human rights. The ongoing needs for local programs on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism is ever more important today, given the insidious rise of modern anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion on social media. Holocaust education sensitizes us to important lessons, including the fact that history is relevant. History challenges us to think critically, not only about the Holocaust, but about the world and our role in it. Though there is no one definition for the Holocaust, when we discuss the Holocaust, we refer to Nazi Germany's state-sponsored attempt to annihilate the Jewish population of Europe. Adolf Hitler saw Jews as a primary enemy of the Aryan race and believed that Germany would become powerful only by ridding itself of the Jews. Starting in 1933, Nazi Germany took measures to humiliate, isolate, persecute the Jews of Germany. The Nazis also targeted other groups in Germany, including the Roma and Shanti, people with disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, Afro-German, homosexuals, and political opponents. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, Nazi policies and violence extended to each of the countries they occupied. By the time World War II ended in 1945, over 6 million Jews have been murdered, among them 1.5 million children. The Holocaust affected Jews across Europe at different times between 1933 and 1945. For example, my husband's family, as German citizens, were affected as early as 1933 with the rise of Hitler to power. My family, as Polish citizens, were affected in September 1939 with the Nazi occupation of Poland 6 years later. Holocaust survivors are Jews who lived under Nazi rule or occupation for any length of time, or those who had to flee the occupation and survived. Each survivor has a unique story to tell. While many Holocaust survivors have actively participated in telling their stories in a variety of settings, others, for various reasons, have never spoken. Recording their stories seemed vital and urgent. Listening to a Holocaust survivor recall his story is becoming a rare occasion. The voice of survivors enhance the effectiveness of the learning process and increase the historical awareness of the understanding of the Holocaust. As the number of survivors is diminishing, Chess undertook to record their stories. The 11 testimony films, which are available on our website, have been used by educators, university professors during public events. They are archived at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington and at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. They cover diverse survival experience in different parts of Europe at different times between 1933 and 1945. They include survival in Nazi slave labor camp and death camps in Poland and Germany, hiding in non-Jewish homes in Holland and France, hiding in a dugout in the Ukraine, surviving in ghettos in safe houses provided by Raoul Wallenberg in Hungary, and surviving as refugees in Romania, Shanghai, in China. Today, you will hear from Kati Morrison, who is a child survivor of the Holocaust. Kati's family lived in Hungary. The Nazi atrocities affected the Jewish population in Hungary starting in March 1944. It is important to note that Hungary, like other European countries, had a long tradition of anti-Semitism. Hungary issued many anti-Jewish laws before the Nazis occupied the country. When the deportation of Hungarian Jews began in the spring of 1944, the Arrow Cross Party, a Hungarian fascist organization, controlled the Hungarian government. They actively supported the Nazi deportation of Hungarian Jews in Hungary, and collaborated with the Nazis by killing and harassing those who were not deported. You will hear more about the Arrow Cross in Kati's testimony. It is fitting that Kati's presentation is happening today. On this day, on April 5th, 1944, the Jews throughout Hungary were forced to start wearing the yellow Star of David. This distinctive sign was another harassment tactic that enabled the Germans to identify the Jews on site. In the context of Holocaust education and survival testimony, Elie Wiesel said, "Whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness." And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kati Morrison, a child survivor of the Holocaust. Kati was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1940. She has been living in Canada for 55 years. To help people understand the impact of genocide, Kati has been sharing her story and her family's survival experience of the Holocaust for the last 15 years in schools and in other interested organizations. Kati, please.
Thank you very much, Mina, for the introduction and the historical background, which will help people to understand my story. Many thanks for inviting me to speak to you today, and special thanks for everyone who participated in liberating us from the occupation in Ottawa this year. I was asked a few questions from the organizers earlier, and one of the questions was about my reaction to the event. As a survivor, I was asked to be interviewed by a journalist. I was scared to give my name. It was a scary experience where maybe I reacted earlier than others, not to see the people as demonstrators, but as occupiers who were very aggressive and had no respect for human rights. I found it particularly painful to watch how the crowd treated the police. That was a painful experience for me to see. Now, our goal today is talking about prejudice, racism, genocide, and as Sam referred to it, it is an uncomfortable topic. So I really appreciate that you have that on your agenda, and we all can learn, and we must learn, partly because many of us have been exposed to other people's racism, prejudice. Also, what I understand about your work, you probably see a lot of people who have been impacted by racism or even genocide. Understanding the racial trauma, which is a term I picked up recently because I listened to a psychological impact of trauma recently when I took a course. And I understand that having the language of racial trauma is an extremely important part for all of us to learn to be able to appreciate other people's experiences. Also, I hope that by talking about the topic, you will also reflect on your own biases. We all have them. And the only way we can counteract them is by being open to other people's experiences. There have been a few questions sent to me earlier, and I really appreciate that because they would be your questions, so I can address them as we go along. Now, one of the questions was, how did I get into this Holocaust education? And I have to tell you that sharing my story was a major step in my life, which I got into by accident. Someone who was doing Holocaust education in Canterbury High School, I had a chat with her, and she said that she is really upset that they are running out of people who have been survivors. And I just wanted to be helpful. And I said, I have a lot of memories, even though I was quite young, and I would be happy to talk about it. I did not have a Jewish life before. Being a Jew was to me to be hated, despised, maybe murdered. The word associated for me with fear. So even though I knew I was Jewish and we spoke openly at home about it, the Jewish existence as part of my identity was hidden even from myself. So I had a Hungarian life, I had a Canadian life, but being Jewish was not part of it. So there I was, having to go to school and having to learn, having to open a box which I was really unaware of. So in the process, I thank the person who invited me, and I thank every organization who allows me to learn more and claim my Jewishness and share with other people who can learn from my and my family's experiences. So the silence is over. Now, the first thing I had to address talking to the school was, who is a Jew? In other words, who am I as a Jew? Now, you probably watched CNN, big kerfuffle about Whoopi Goldberg making a comment about no racism involved in the Holocaust. Don Lemon at CNN said, I'm not surprised she doesn't know. I don't know. Is it a religion? Is it a race? What is it? So many people thought that that was a learning opportunity for everybody. But for me, it started 15 years ago when I did the Holocaust education. So the fact is that there is no such a thing as race, as a biological scientific entity. We are all a human race. And Jews come in any shape or size. Some are in Africa, some are in China, some are in South America. So even if you think about the color concept, they are from every place in the world. Race was used by the Germans to submit the Jews as inferior. So when people use race, they often use it because they want to have power over them and they make themselves feel superior. And that has been the case with the Black slaves also, that racism starts with separating us from our humanity. Now, it's not a religion to be Jewish because a lot of people are not religious. Also, people can get into being Jewish by converting. Some Jews are cultural, some of Jews are historical Jews, or some are ethical. And I'm an ethical Jew with a Holocaust in my historical background. Now, thank you, Mina. You have addressed the main aspects of the Holocaust. And I'm talking about it particularly from the Hungarian perspective, the gradual increase of the laws to make life impossible. And that will be illustrated in the video. Now, most of my extended family, 32, were murdered after the German invasion to Budapest. But it did not start with that. And while all this was taking place after the invasion in March 1944, the world was watching, not allowing refugees to come. And Canada was no exception. Only the victory of the Allies of the Second World War put a stop to the annihilation. Canada is coming to terms with the racist past now, and the new leadership is acknowledging the true history and is working towards healing. Mentioning that, I have to just let you know that Holocaust denial is going to be criminalized as we are speaking now. That is a law, what has been forwarded in the parliament. Also, there are many organizations by the government to fight racism. So talking about anti-Semitism, what's important here is to know that anti-Semitism didn't die in Auschwitz. There was before and it was after. And in fact, in Canada, the most targeted minorities are the Jews, and these are well documented. It happens in schools, in synagogues, in universities. So learning about it is absolutely essential. Now, I'd like to say a few words about my testimony before you actually see it. It was not just that I was a child survivor, but because I have not come to terms with the impact of the Holocaust, I was still living in the magic of our survival, because we, four of us, my mother, my father, my sister, and I, survived by miracles. And I could talk a lot about the miracles, and that's how we lived. We felt that our survival was a miracle, and my parents were so optimistic about the future that when I tell my testimony, that was only in 2016. I was not as much aware as I became later on the impact, which I'm going to share with you after you watch the testimony. But I just would like to point out to you that maybe you can watch it now with a different eye than I was doing it at the time. For example, you watch my grandmother, who was over 70 years old at the time, and try to imagine what it was like for her to have full care of two children, my sister and myself, my sister still in diaper, having minimal food, no support whatsoever. Two of her children were taken away, which means taken away to concentration camp, to slave labor, not knowing where they are, if they will ever come back or they'll be killed. And her sister has been murdered, practically under our eyes. And that was the grandmother who kept us alive, not just safe physically, but also spiritually, by singing songs to my sister. I was tone deaf even then. So I thought that's important to think about today, what it was like for the adults. Now, there is a photo there where my father, my mother, my sister, and I are there. And you will see that on the video. And my father titled that, Condemned to Death. We were asking for protective papers, and that's what the picture was taken for. I don't think that the title is part of my talk on the video. Now, Holocaust education is part of my life. Silence is not an option, and it has to be part of an awareness of human rights violations wherever they happen. Please start the video.
You know you live a lie. You don't really know it consciously, but you are Jewish, and you can't say, because if you say it, you don't know what will happen. In fact, you know what will happen. So that affected my life. I mean, many, many years after I came to Canada, I never told anybody. So it was a long process for me, and I didn't even know what Jew was, because we were not brought up religious. And yes, it affected me greatly. I didn't feel the world was a safe place, ever. My name is Kati Morrison. I was born in 1940, September, in Budapest, Hungary. My parents moved out from my mother's parents' place in order to start a family. And so we had a 2-room apartment. I lived there with them for 3 years before the war started. I was admired, and my father made poems about every milestone I made. I was a very happy kid, especially that I was born right after my maternal grandfather died. So my birth was really giving a lot of uplift for the family. And I talked very early, and when you talk about neighborhood, when you live in a 4 or 5 story building, the neighbors are all around the corridor. And it was a very safe world, so as soon as I could walk, I would walk to the neighbors, and they would love to have me there. So I would be chatting with them, and it was perfectly safe. And so I went and asked if they had any candy. My mother forbade me to ask for candy, and I said I never asked to give it to me, I just asked if they had any. So it was a very, comfortable life. We had a housekeeper, and, she was very nice to me, and that's all I can say, that it was a very happy time. And then, of course, my sister was born in 1943, yes. My grandfather passed away I was 6 weeks old. He was a surgeon, a urologist. He and my grandmother, who was the first woman ophthalmologist in Budapest, Hungary, which will be significant later on in my story, they had a big 6-room apartment, and they had each of them their medical office. Now, this was many years before the actual persecution, but to find a job for Jewish doctors was very difficult. So my grandfather worked for free clinics a lot, apart from his office, and my grandmother became a doctor in a school. So apart from having her office as an ophthalmologist at home. My father was a trained rabbi, because he wanted to go to medical school, but it was not possible for Jews to go to university at that time, and he did not have any means of support. So he went to the seminary, became a rabbi, but never functioned as a rabbi. He was teaching religion in high school. So around the time I was born, he was in a Berzsenyi high school, and that again is quite significant, because the students there were discriminated against way before the actual persecution started, and they were not allowed to join the Boy Scouts because they were Jews. So my father organized a hiking group every Sunday. The students and in her class and their parents, they were all included. They went hiking every Sunday. My mother wasn't too happy about that. So my mother was a piano teacher, and at that time there was no job given to a music teacher, so she had private students, and she spent all day going from house to house teaching students piano before the war. My grandparents had a more observant household, and ours was as much as it was necessary for my father's profession. He didn't really believe in a lot of rituals, and I don't remember for the first few years of my life anything relating to being raised Jewish. Sometime in 1944, when we had to leave our house, our apartment, and we had to move to designated houses, which had a star on them, that's where Jews could live. And the apartment where we lived in was not one of those houses, so we basically had to evacuate. And that I remember vividly because we hired a man with a wagon, and he pulled it, and all our belongings were on it. If you've seen the Fiddler on the Roof, it was very similar. But for me as a child, I thought it was fun. We were walking on the street behind this man, and my parents were walking together to bring all our belongings, what we could bring, to my grandmother's house, because that was a house which was Jews were allowed to go. Yeah, so we moved over there. It was early 1944 when all the restrictions were what I remember, that I could not go to any park. I couldn't go anywhere on the street. And so I couldn't go out to play, which was the major thing what parents did with their children. They took them to the park every day. So we were not allowed. My parents had to wear a yellow star. I remember when they were sewing it on. I liked life in my grandmother's building, you see, so there were a lot of people around. And I remember very clearly that my grandmother, because she had a big apartment, and by that time, you know, she wasn't working, so she basically opened the door for other people who had to go to a specially designated Jewish house, people she did not know. So we had a couple of older women from a Jewish retirement home, and we had an actor's Jewish partner who was there. We had another couple. So the house was full with people. And there were bombings. The sirens were going regularly. And so the sirens went, then we had to run down to the cellar. I could say that the one thing which was difficult for me was that my sister was a baby, and if she did not get food, she was screaming from the top of her lungs. So the sirens came, and the first thing everybody did, rushing to make food, because if they don't bring food to the cellar, then everybody will be mad at us that we are letting her scream. So I kind of felt ignored. That was the one thing that I do remember. And once actually everybody went to the cellar, and I hid under a bed. And I just thought, you know, are they ever going to notice? So the parents were preoccupied. I don't remember anybody playing with me. I just watched what was going all around. So people were obviously very anxious, which I know now when I think back about it. But as a child, I felt like, I don't matter as much as I did before, and I could just hide and nobody will know. And then, of course, they didn't want to go to the cellar without me. And I remember that one of the ladies who lived with us looked under the bed, and then she pulled me out. So that was the one thing. You know, my parents were amazing. They dressed us up, people in the cellar, and I mean, there were hundreds of people down there from a 4 or 5 story building. They said, this family is thinking they are going to a party, because they are always dressing up the girls. So, my parents really wanted to create an atmosphere of playfulness as much as it was humanly possible. As a child, the only thing I remember is when there was a gendarme or arrow cross downstairs, and I looked out, and they were collecting people to take them away. That was the only thing. I wasn't allowed to go out, right? So I only saw who came to the building. And it was 1 or 2 gendarmes, and the superintendent was pointing out where the Jews were in the building. And so if anybody didn't come down, and that was when they started to take them away. Then they pointed out, oh, there is somebody up there. Yeah, so my father was taken away in October 1944, and my mother was taken away in November 1944. My grandmother told me that my mother went to be a soldier to protect the country. That's all she told me. And, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother before, and so it was a very smooth transition for me. My mother was working during the day. Yeah, so when I was, as I was growing up, I actually have to tell you, it was like I switched off, and I was with my grandmother, and I was feeling fine. My mother, they walked them to Austria, and then from there she went to Germany. She ended up liberated in Dachau. She was in Turkheim before. She was away until the following August 1945. They were liberated in April. And she developed tuberculosis. And while in hospital, she fell off a bed and broke her back, which was not even diagnosed or discovered until coming to Canada, like some 40 years later. So she wrote her memoirs, and the worst thing what happened to her was to be separated from her children. She said, I can forgive everything, but not that. Yeah, because, we both, my sister and I, became detached. And so what she kept her going was that she knew, she said, I know that they are alive. And so after the liberation, when they were able to go to different stores and take anything they wanted, she brought a huge knapsack full of toys. And that's how she came back with the toys, because, that was in her mind, that she'll come back to us. But the Hungarians never sent anybody for people who were liberated from concentration camps, so it took for her from April 27 to August to get home, to get transportation. Yeah. So after my father was gone, we still stayed in this apartment building. So I didn't see, anybody else. I was just in there. And my parents or my grandmother were allowed out for 2 hours a day. That I remembered. But I don't remember being hungry. I was just walking in the corridor and said his name. And I was very upset. And that was the one reaction I had. You learn very quickly not to react, even as a child, because they didn't want us to be aware or upset. My father was taken away with my uncle, and my mother was taken away with a neighbor girlfriend's mother. The two of them went away. And this girl is still a friend of mine. Okay, she searched me out just a few years ago. Her mother and my mother were taken away, and her mother wanted to escape. And my mother said, anybody who escapes will be shot. She said, but I want to go to my daughter. And so she got up and left, and she was shot. On that day, we had to move. So I don't remember the actual how we got there, but I remember the place where we went from there. And it was my grandmother, my grandmother's sister, Eiko, and my sister in a carriage, and I. So the four of us went to the so-called protective house. It was 4 or 5 stories. Again, we were not allowed out. So we were in about a 2-bedroom apartment, about 70 or 80 people. We had enough room to just lie down, even sometime on top of each other. And there was a lot of discussion, a lot of yelling, a lot of crying going on. So, my grandmother somehow managed to get some food from home. So she fed us when we were there, and my sister was in a carriage. So at least, her space was guaranteed. And so I just had a little basket, what was the only thing I had as a toy, so to speak, what I got from my paternal grandmother, and I carried that with me. And I was just watching the adults. I was just watching the adults because, you know, at that time, children were not mixing with adults in normal conversations. So I kind of liked the crowd, and I liked the kerfuffle. I don't know exactly about our particular situation, but I know that it was a protected house, and there were really a few very heroic people like Wallenberg and a few other people who were giving protective papers to people as if we were under their jurisdiction. So I'm not sure what kind of protective papers my grandmother had that allowed us to go to this building. So that was before we went to the ghetto, so that was supposed to be protective. But every day a family was taken away and shot, and everybody was killed from that building later on. So the Arrow Cross went there regardless of that being protected. I think from the 70,000 who were in a ghetto, 20,000 were in protective houses originally. What happened was on the 3rd of January, which I found out later, the date, Arrow Cross came to the building and asked everybody from the whole building, everybody come downstairs. There were several hundred people in this, 4 or 5 story building, and gathered behind the courtyard around the staircase and line up. I had no idea what it was about, but there was an Arrow Cross man who looked at my grandmother and did like this. And my grandmother went and pulled us under the staircase where it was sort of a shady spot. But her sister, Eiko, started to scream that don't take the children, don't take the children. And my grandmother said, come back, don't run, just stay here with me. And she went right across, and the Arrow Cross man just said, get to the line. And that was the last we saw her. So that was my grandmother's sister. So then we know that everybody from that building were taken to the shore of the Danube and shot. So that is what we found out, that's what happened, and that's what commemorates the shoes, which have been done there in 2005 to commemorate the thousands of Jews who were shot to the river during this period of time. My grandmother told after the war to my parents later that he recognized her as he was her patient, and that's how her being an ophthalmologist saved our life. And also her presence, her state of mind, that she was able to read the sign and hide us. And they all went. And so that was, you could say, a miracle, really, that it happened, yeah. But then the house was firebombed. So what do you do when you are there with a baby and a small child? First she went upstairs, which anybody would have been shot just going back up because she had no food with her. She went up to the apartment where we were, and with her fist she broke down the lock and brought some food and came down, and the house was the whole building was then firebombed. That was the war. And so what is she to do? So there she peeked out to the main courtyard, and on the other side the door was open, and on the other side of the street people were waving to her to come, because Jews were not allowed to be on the street, and you can't go anywhere but to Jewish houses. So there she was, my sister in the carriage, and told me not to look. I remember that. But of course I did look, because I found it fascinating. It was like sparkling everywhere, fire. And later on, I asked a friend of mine, I told her the story to make a painting out of that experience. And then we went across. We went to the other side, and then people allowed us in and gave us some hot chocolate and some warm clothes. But it was a Christian house. We were not allowed to stay there. And so they directed us to where the ghetto was. So we went we walked over to the ghetto from this protected house, so to speak, yeah. In the ghetto, we had a tiny room, which probably was a small washing room or a bathroom, or a larger bathroom. And we were there. There was a 100-year-old lady with her nurse, and my grandmother, my sister, and I. It was a very small space, which I did not mind. And there was a big cupboard, and my grandmother, and we had a mattress on the floor. That was it. And so we slept on the mattress. We ate on the mattress. We sat down there, and my grandmother would give 1 spoon barley. That was what we ate. We were given barley every day, and 1 spoon for my sister and 1 spoon for me. And actually, because she was a doctor, they gave her the job of a coroner in the building, because people died there right and left of starvation, of sickness, and there was no doctor or treating anything. And so they gave her double amount of food, and actually she gave us all her food. And so there was a bag of dry pea on the top of the cupboard, and that's what she chewed. I just remembered she always chewed on something, and so that's what I found out later. So we had our head behind the cupboard, because the big window towards the courtyard, we were on the ground floor. If there is shooting, then they could get us through the window. So my grandmother made sure, and I kind of liked to be sort of cozy there, the three of us. And then my grandmother also was teaching my sister. I mean, by that time my sister was over a year old, a year and 4 months, and she taught her singing. She knew about 50 or 80 songs. She was singing to her. Taking care is not a concept, okay, at that time. Now there was this 100-year-old lady with a nurse in our same room. So I kind of presumed later that that she was watching, but there was nowhere to go. And so, she closed the door. There was a cellar downstairs where sometimes I went, and there were some children there. But, that's what I remember. We were there for about more than 2 weeks. Yeah, because on the 18th of January, my father appeared at the door. And so the Budapest was liberated. It was 17th or 18th. The Russians came and they surrounded Budapest. So my father was in a work battalion, and they were placed in a place, arena, okay, where they sort of just slept on the beton, and he heard the news from word of mouth. People were telling that, the Russians are coming and the end is over soon. And so just before it was over, he escaped. And again, people were not allowed to walk on the street, and he was almost shot. Like a bullet went like this beside his face. He escaped to look for us. And so he eventually found us in the ghetto, and that's when so the next day, if the Russians did not surround, he would have been taken out to Germany. That was the plan. I remember that as clearly as it was yesterday. His face was just engraved in me, that I remember right away. I said his name. I called him Little Father. He wanted me to call him Opam, my father, But I was a child, and when he said, call me Opam, and I said Opam Ko, okay, which is little father. So that became his name. That is even on his gravestone. So when he arrived, I didn't notice he wore a child's clothes, a 13-year-old child's clothes. He lost 50 pounds. He was smiling, and my grandmother started to cry. I actually wrote a poem about that many, many years later, because at that time, I told my grandmother, why are you crying? People should be laughing, should be happy. And so then he came, and then my sister, she didn't know him, but he did not force himself at all. Here I am. We were not a huggy family. But she started to sing, and so that was my father. Missed, of course, all the milestones in her life, but so that was the reunion. And so then we walked back to my grandmother's apartment, where we were before, right, with my father. So I just wanted to mention to you there were dead people everywhere on the street when we were walking back, because people from the ghettos, if they were dead, they just put them out. So there were dead people, dead horses, dead soldiers on the street. And so I didn't know what it was, and my grandmother said they were sleeping. My father organized Jewish children's recuperation from the war to summer camp. So I was there for a few weeks, I don't know for how long, in Buda, which is not too far. It's just the other side of Pest. And he said, or somebody said, there will be a big surprise that my mother will be back the following Sunday, that he came to visit me on Sunday. And so then I saw my father, and there were two women on each side of him, and I guessed, because I had no clue which one was my mother, and I guessed right. So, I was only 5, but I knew what to do. I ran to her, and as I said, we were not a huggy family. I ran and I gave her a big hug. And I was right, she was my mother. But because, you see, they shaved her hair, so she had very short hair, very different from what it was, and she blew up. She was a thin woman, but after the war, after the starvation, when people were fed and they blew up, they became very big. So she was not recognizable for me, okay? So that was the reunion, and she valued that I did that forever. So, faking became a way of life, yeah? You don't ask yourself how you feel about things, you do what you have to do, yeah? Because you're very young, you learn that your voice doesn't matter, yeah? What matters is that you survive. And these are the people who, care about you. But with my father, I had no issue about not remembering, but I did not remember my mother, yeah. We survived, my parents, my sister and I, and my grandmother, and my uncle. So it was affecting me forever, that I don't have extended family, I don't have relatives like other people have. The other thing was that I knew, even though nobody said that I shouldn't talk about being Jewish, but the war affected me in that way, that being Jewish meant to be killed. So we always knew we were Jewish, but it was not reinforced, because the family felt that they had to adapt. In fact, that's one of the things what my father wrote to the Jews in Hungary, and I have the article what he wrote in August 1945, that we are condemned to eternal mourning because we don't have a grave to our loved ones, and the events are in our conscience. It's going to be with us forever, and we will not be free until we die from the pain. But we need to keep it inside, and externally we have to be calm, and we have to adapt, and we need to forgive people, not just with words, but forgive with our actions, that they were misled, and we are all Hungarians, and so I have seen no hatred in my home. There was no revenge, there was no mention of who did this to us. They were real idealists, unfortunately. It helped me as a child, but it affected me in a long way, because you live a lie. You don't really know it consciously, but you are Jewish, and you can't say, because if you say it, you don't know what will happen. In fact, you know what will happen. So that affected my life. I mean, many, many years after I came to Canada, I never told anybody. So it was a long process for me, and I didn't even know what Jew was, because we were not brought up religious. And yes, it affected me greatly. I didn't feel the world was a safe place, ever, yeah, until I came to Canada.
Okay, so thank you very much for showing the testimony. And I have a couple of really wonderful questions. Maybe I will start my talk after video talk with the questions. One is a very interesting one about the miracles. What do I think the miracles were due to that we survived? And I think that I have to say the miracles were my parents and my grandmother. My grandmother, who was so stoic, heroic, she told us that my mother is a soldier, because being a slave laborer who is going to be starved and probably will be murdered is a really shameful situation, whereas soldiers are proud of having a weapon and protect the family. Even though she had no idea where my mother was, but the truth hit me later about feeling ashamed for what happened to my family. But getting back to the miracle, it was a miracle that the Nazi who came and took everybody from the building, several hundreds of people, was the patient of my grandmother, and he recognized her and showed the way to hide. So we were not taken and shot to the river like everybody else. So either people were shot to the river or they were in a cellar in the building which burned down. So they were burned there. So I say that was a miracle in itself, but it was not a miracle from above. It was my grandmother's heroic position and her having been the doctor. It was an accident. Now, in terms of my mother, her survival, she wrote her story of the Holocaust, and she was very proud of having remained true to herself. She said she has never given up being a human being. In fact, on a train where they were all taken somewhere, at the end of the war, practically, she saw a woman pregnant and stood up and gave her her seat. So the pregnant woman could sit down, and my mother sat down on the ground, on the floor on the train. And there were bombings around, and the woman where she sat, she died. And my mother survived. So there were coincidences and their state of mind. So I'm not talking about just surviving in body, but surviving in spirit. And that was the miracle. Then my mother was a pianist, but she never told anybody that she could play the piano because she did not want to be used for entertaining the Germans. She was fluent in German, never told them that she spoke German. So she had the strength of character which kept her going and an optimism which I refer to as an insane optimism because there was no hope in the present. But she had it inside herself that we will survive. And that's what kept her going. And so that was my father. My father was helping everybody, even before was taken away. When he was teaching children in a high school, he went to beg rich people to give money to some of the students whom he was teaching so they could be put on a train and escape. So he saved many lives. So when you are that kind of person, wherever you are, you feel good about who you are. When he was in a slave labor, our neighbor, the my little girlfriend's grandfather, who was an old man, was with them. And my father organized the group that they carried his luggage, they carried his workload. Otherwise, he would have been shot. And every time I saw the old man after the war, he just lifted up his arm. He said, "He saved my life." So you see, what kept them going? My father and my uncle were telling stories. My father was a psychoanalyst. He told stories about human behavior at night after they were digging trenches. They were starving, but at night. And my uncle was telling stories about ancient history. He was an ancient historian. Half dead, frozen, hungry, but their spirit was incredibly strong. So when I'm talking about miracle, I'm talking about my family and coincidences. Okay, so that was one question. And religion really doesn't come to it. Now, the other question I partly answered, which was, what do I attribute my resilience? My parents were so loving, caring, and so much accepting being part of Hungary that without hatred and without any feeling of revenge, which a lot of people have lived with, I was feeling as free as one could be, as long as I cut off my Jewish identity. So that was part of the resilience. Education was a very high value. They would sacrifice anything for it, however poor we were. If I wanted to be a doctor, then they will put me through. So we were very poor. So what I'm saying is that the resilience is partly due to them, and partly, I was smart, so it helped me in school. But surviving and looking like resilient is not the same as having an internal good feeling about who you are, which I did not have. I was ashamed, and I didn't know why until I found out why. Because somehow people who have gone through genocide experiences, they somehow feel that internalize some of the hatred what was exposed to them. So that was one issue. Now the other issue was that because, as you could see on the video, I was 4 years old and I knew how to look after my mother. So I became a so-called parental child. I became a caregiver. My childhood was ending at the war. So you could look at it as a strength that I was able to see what my parents needed, that I study well, but I could not turn to them for anything because I didn't want to burden them with any of my needs. They found it surprising. They could not understand why. I don't even ask for an ice cream. So I looked very healthy, and I was quite happy with my girlfriends and managing, when we were together, we were always happy. Every night was a reunion when we were all together. So, so that would answer the question of what do I attribute the resilience. My parents' insane optimism and idealism, helping the country, helping the Hungarians, and of course, it did not change anti-Semitism, but it was undercover. So it was not upfront, and their hope and optimism and strength really rubbed off on all of us. We had a good sense of humor, lots of storytelling about the past, and they were honest with us about their experiences. So it was not that I was in a fog about it. So it turned out, in terms of the consequences, that when my mother came to Canada in 2079, and I was concerned about her mental state, which was partly why I brought her out at the time, rather than just coming for a visit. She was diagnosed with major depression since the Second World War. She was very anxious for our well-being, but she was not able to empathize with us. She had a way of looking after us that our inner world was non-existent. So I found out a lot of things as I was learning more about the impact of genocide or racial trauma, that I was able to put it together. So looking after others was a way of my life. Okay, looking after myself, that came much later. Now, when my mother got treatment here in Canada, she was an amazing, happy person who was able to set up a music school. 30 students, they still remember her. Some of them became professional musicians. She was a very different human being. So I'm talking about the impact of the Holocaust on my family. My father, though he didn't tell us that he was living in eternal grief, I found that out 20 years ago when I searched and found this article, what he wrote. But children relate to the unconscious of the parents. They don't have to talk. You sense what is happening. So you don't want to be a burden for somebody who is going through eternal grief, even though I was having no words for it, partly because I wasn't aware he was hiding it from us, but also because we didn't have the vocabulary, which is now what we are coming out with. Now, are there any other questions in the meantime?
Yeah, Kati, we have a few in the chat. One says, I'm assuming that sharing your story must be difficult, but does it become easier for you each time?
Sharing my story gives me a sense of optimism. Sharing it, I did not find difficult, except I didn't want to during the occupation here in Ottawa. But people who are interested in learning because they want to have the world a safer place, because they want to know what prejudice, hatred, anti-Semitism can do to people. They want to learn, and it gives me a sense of optimism. When I go to schools, I find from the students' questions, they want to do better. They want to know that nothing will happen what happened in the past. So that sharing is not difficult. In this situation, that's the first time that my video is shown. So I don't have my own pictures to show, but I have the before and after. So that was a little difficult because I also wanted to be honest about the impact because of the audience, that people who are looking after others vulnerable. So that was an extra homework I had to do, and I am very grateful that I have done that, and I hope that people can benefit from that.
Kati, another question says, the end of the war did not mean the end of the malevolent attitudes and ideologies of the Semites. It seems to me that it is rising again as the years pass. Have you any insight into how, as a society, we can move away from whatever fostered that malevolence?
Now, that's a wonderful question, and I refer you to Barbara Coloroso, who wrote a book about genocide. Her book, she was a Catholic nun who became a genocide educator. Her book, The Brief History of Genocide. Genocide is not an outside of the realm of ordinary human behavior. At the same time, it's not normal and it's not necessary. The extreme form of bullying, a far too common behavior that is learned in childhood and rooted in contempt for another human being. So what is learned, it can be unlearned in childhood. So educating people about the Holocaust, about openness, about accepting others, different color, culture, religion, the differences, and people who are not in our smallest circle, not looking at them as the enemy, but looking at them as other human beings we can learn from and we can be kind to and appreciate. That starts very young age. So when it's child education, and chess is fantastic about bringing it to school through the teacher training, but we all are responsible. We all are responsible of our own prejudices and what we do at home, what we do in institutions, what we do in churches, because those were the institutions that were propagating hatred. So as adults, we need to reassess our earlier indoctrination and question it. So we develop our own backbone and we don't just not hurt other people, but we are not going to be bystanders looking at other people who are bullying someone else. So I don't know, this is as short an answer as I could do with such a complex question.
And it's a deep answer too, Kati. Kati, one more question, and I have a couple more. Based on your experience, do you see any parallels to what is currently happening in the Ukraine? With the recent news of atrocities, the person asking the question says, I worry that history is repeating itself, but that is only from an academic perspective. While the Russian invasion does not have a direct connection to religion, I can't help but feel like this is what the invasion of Poland in 1939 must have felt like. So do you see any parallels with Ukraine?
I wish I knew more history, but it's really not relevant because what you see is right in front of you. And what you see in front of you is genocide. And now they are finding mass graves. They are, I mean, today, that's what I saw. Now, the parallel is the hatred, the total lack of control, of bullying, taking over, using the power. But people on the Ukrainian side have weapons. They have their pride. They have the whole world supporting them. And more than 4 million are leaving, and people are waiting for them with open arms. So there are some things that are not comparable. But again, it's not a religious war. It's not a racist war. It's based on hatred and bullying, right? So that is a parallel. And we don't know what is in the minds of people in Russia, why they do this. They are misled, which is again the parallel. They don't know what is going on because their media is shut down. They only hear what the Russian bureaucracy is telling them. So they don't know that they are the attackers. They were told that they are cleaning the world from Nazis. So again, unfortunate, but that is another parallel where people can be misled, distort the reality, and when they are allowed to have aggression uncontrolled because of the greed for power. So there are similarities and there are major differences.
Kati, another question says, can you talk about the impact of trauma on your children and the descendants of child survivors? There seems to be a movement now for children and grandchildren of survivors to reclaim their lost culture and Jewish identities. Do you feel this reclamation means that we are heading away from the past?
I don't understand heading away from the past.
Do you feel this reclamation means that we are heading or healing from the past? Sorry.
Oh, okay. You see, there were many studies on the children of Holocaust survivors and their children, and they were found to be healthy. They were not found to have the impact, but when I shared the impact, okay, I am a psychiatrist. I have been insightful about it. I learned a lot about it. Most research finds, and anybody who would have tested me would have found me more than normal, okay? I was a happy person, well functioning in society. So you're talking about my children's generation. I don't have children of my own. I raised stepchildren who knew nothing about being Jewish on my part because at that time I wasn't open. And they are very interested. They benefited from my experiences because I wanted to protect them from every kind of danger, okay, what there is in the world. So in a way, they were not traumatized. They were benefiting from my experiences. So I know that there is an association for second and third generations. What they seem to be having a need for is reclaiming the past because the survivors hid what happened to them. So part of their history was gone, not because of the children didn't want to know, but because the parents felt that it was for their own sanity, the parents, and for the children's sake, it had to be hidden. And society wanted nothing to do with the history either. So they are reclaiming, and now memoirs are coming up, even now, when there are hardly any survivors left who remember. So I don't think it will be forgotten, but I think that people learn from it and they are fighting not just against anti-Semitism, but against human rights violations. So it is turning into a positive force in the next and next generation. That is my impression. Much more sensitive to human rights violations because of what happened. And I just mentioned to you here of the March 2022 in Canada, the National Action Plan for Combating Hate in Canada. This is the first, right? So the further generations seeing what is happening, Jewish or not Jewish, okay, there is a much more increased awareness and responsibility.
Kati, we have time for one more question, so I'm going to take advantage and ask my own question. You had mentioned that your parents, after the war, did not seek revenge or feel hatred towards other Hungarians, and you, as you learned your story and learned their story growing up, how come you've chosen love and compassion over hate? Did you ever struggle with any feelings of wanting revenge, contrary to what your parents did?
Actually, one of the reactions I had to all what happened to me was an inhibition of anger. I was not just brought up with my parents' loving nature and having no anger expressed at the people, but I went to the other extreme, and I wasn't even angry about things that other normal people would be angry about. So I changed in that now, but stereotyping is a crime. So you cannot hate a country, you cannot hate a nation, you can hate a behavior, and you can hate what they do to other people. But this is another generation now, and they cannot be held responsible for their parents' and grandparents' crimes, but they could be responsible for their own. So where I stand is that I don't live with hate because there is not a person I can put a finger on. And because, as I said, I don't believe in stereotyping just because. But I tell you one thing, when I meet Hungarians, I want to know very quickly if they are anti-Semitic or not, because many statistics show that anti-Semitism is very high, still there. Yeah. But I don't, so I don't want to associate. But if somebody is racist, even if it's not anti-Semitism, racism is not in my vocabulary to relate to somebody. If they want to learn about it, that's different. Yeah. So, we live with ourselves, number one, right? And living with hatred and revenge is going nowhere. It's not a direction that is helping you. And I'm not talking about forgiving, because I am not a saint and I do not forgive the crimes committed against my parents, against my family. But I don't live with hatred. Yeah. I don't think you can be healthy and live with that. Yeah. And I'm very fortunate that I am meeting so many people who want to make the world a better place. So why would I not turn my heart towards those people? Right?
That's such a beautiful message to end with, Kati. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. Ceci a été vraiment une présentation unique. I'm sure those who attended today will never forget your story or your parents' story. If any audience members have any additional questions for Kati or Mina, please email them to Chess or to jessica@sidepony.ca. The email addresses can be found at the beginning of the chat. Merci à ceux qui ont assisté à la présentation d'aujourd'hui. Je vous souhaite une bonne fin d'après-midi. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone. Thank you for those who attended today's presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.